humankind from prehistory to the present day time. Modern humans evolved in Africa around 300,000 years ago, and they initially lived as something that we called hunter-gatherers. Basically, back then they didn't have stoves, they didn't have microwaves, so they would build weapons and go out and hunt their food, and they would go out and hunt their food and gather it. Um, Now, they migrated out of Africa during the last ice age, and they had spread across Earth's continental land except Antarctica by the end of the ice age 12,000 years ago. Soon afterward, the Neolithic Revolution in West Asia brought the first systematic husbandry of plants and animals, um, and saw that many humans transition from a nomadic life to a sedentary existence as farmers in permanent settlements. The growing complexity of human societies necessitated systems of accounting and writing. Um, now these developments paved the way for the emergence of early civilizations in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley in China, and marking the beginning of the 500 BC. Supported the establishment of regional empires, the ones being Hinduism during the late Bronze Age and during the Axial Age, Buddhism, Confucianism, Greek philosophy, Jainism, Judaism, Taoism, and Zoroastrianism. Now, the post-classical period, from about 500 to 1500, to the year 1500, witnessed the rise of Islam and the continued spread and consolidation of Christianity, while civilization expanded to new parts of the world and trade between societies increased. These developments were accompanied by the rise and decline of major empires such as the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic Caliphates, the Mongol Empire, and various Chinese dynasties. Now, during this period, the invention of gunpowder and of the printing press greatly affected the subsequent history. Now, during early modern period, spanning from approximately 1500 to 1800 CE, BC, or 1500 to 1800, I don't know if that's BC or 80, European powers explored and they colonized regions worldwide. Now, intensifying cultural and economic exchange, this era had saw substantial cultural and technological advances in Europe. Um, no, then this was driven by the Renaissance, the Reformation in Germany, giving rise to Protestantism, a scientific revolution, and the Age of Enlightenment. Um, by the 18th century, the accumulation of knowledge and technology had reached a critical mass that brought about the Industrial Revolution, substantial to the Great Divergence, and began the modern period starting around 1800. Um, the rapid growth in productive power further increased international trade and colonization. And this linking the different civilizations in the process of globalization, and they cemented European dominance throughout the 19th century. Now, over the last 250 years, which included two devastating world wars, which was World War One and World War Two, there has been a great acceleration in many spheres, including human population, agriculture, industry, commerce, scientific knowledge, technology, communications, military capabilities, and environmental degradation. Um, relies on insights from academic disciplines, which include history, archaeology, anthropology, linguistics, and genetics. Now, to provide an accessible overview, researchers divide human history by a variety of different periods. Um, Now, when it comes to human history, humans evolved in Africa from apes through the lineage of hominins, which arose about 7 to 5 million years ago. The ability to walk on two legs emerged in early hominins after the split from chimpanzees. As an adaptation possibly associated with the shift from forest to savanna habits. Hominins began to use rudimentary stone tools around 3.3 million years ago, marking the advent of the Paleolithic era. Now, the genus now the word now the word Homo, meaning Homo sapien, evolves from the word Australopithecus. The earliest record of the word Homo sapien is the 2.8 million year old specimen LD 351 from Ethiopia. and the earliest named species is Homo habilis, which evolved around 2.3 million years ago. And the most important difference between the Homo habilis and the Australopithecus was a 50% increase in a brain size. Now, now Homo erectus evolved the word Homo evolved about 2 million years ago, and it was the first hominin species to leave Africa and just across Eurasia. Um, Now, perhaps as early as 1.5 million years ago, but certainly about 250,000 years ago, the hominins began to use fire for heat and cooking. Now, beginning about 500,000 years ago, the word Homo into many new species of archaic humans, such as the Neanderthals in Europe and the Denisovans in Siberia, and the H. Floresianus in Indonesia. Now, human evolution was not a simple linear or branch progression, but involved interbreeding between related species. Genomic research has shown that hybridization between substantially diverged lineages was common in human evolution. DNA evidence suggests that several genes of Neanderthal origin are present among all non-sub-Saharan African populations. Now, Neanderthals and other hominins, such as Denisovans, may have contributed up to 6% of their genome to present-day non-sub-Saharan African humans. Now, 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 Homo sapiens emerged in Africa around 300,000 years ago from the species Homo heidelbergensis. Now, Now, humans would continue to develop over the succeeding millennia, and by 100,000 years ago, they were using jewelry and ochre to adorn the body. By 50,000 years ago, they would bury their dead, use projectile weapons, and engaged in seafaring. One of the most important changes to date is which is and it's unknown, was the development of syntactic language, which would dramatically improve the human ability to communicate with others. Now, signs of early art expression came of cave paintings and sculptures made from ivory, stone, and bone, implying a form of spiritually generally and interpreted as animism or shamanism. Now, the earliest known musical instruments besides the human voice are bone flutes from the Swabian Jura in Germany, dated around 40,000 years ago, and Paleolithic humans lived as hunter-gatherers and they were generally nomadic. Um, Now, anatomically, modern humans migrated out of Africa in multiple waves beginning around 194,000 to 177,000 years ago. The dominant view among scholars that the early migration died out and all modern non-Africans are descended from a single group that left Africa around 70,000 to 500,000 years ago, or 50,000 years ago. Homo sapiens proceeded to colonize all the larger islands, arriving in Australia around 65,000 years ago. Europe 45,000 years ago, and the U.S. 21,000 years ago. Now, these migrations occurred during the most recent ice age, when various temperate regions of today were inhospitable, means you couldn't live there. Basically, nevertheless, by the end of the ice age, some 12,000 years ago, humans had colonized nearly all ice-free parts of the globe. Human expansion coincided with both the quaternary extinction event and the Neanderthal extinction. Um, Now, these extinctions were probably caused by climate change, human activity, or a combination of the two. Um, beginning around 10,000 BC, the Neolithic Revolution marked the development of agriculture, which fundamentally changed the human lifestyle and how they operated. Um, Agriculture began independently in different parts of the globe, and included a diverse range of taxa and at least 11 separate centers of origin. Cereal crop cultivation and animal domestication had occurred in Mesopotamia at about at least around 85 at least 8,500 BC in the form of wheat, barley, sheep, and goats. Um, Now the Yangtze River Valley in China domesticated rice around 8,000 to 7 between the years of 8,000 to 7,000 BC, and the Yellow River Valley may have cultivated millet by 7,000 BC. Um, Pigs were the most important domesticated animal in early China. People in Africa's Sahara cultivated sorghum um, and several other crops between 8,000 and 500 BC. 5,000 BC, where agricultural centers arose in the Ethiopian highlands rainforests. Um, in the Indus River Valley, cultivated 7,000 BC, and cattle were domesticated by 6,500 BC. In America, squash was cultivated by at least 8,500 by the year 8,500 BC in South America, and domesticated arrowroot appeared in Central America by 7,800 BC. Um, Now, potatoes were first cultivated in the Andes of South America, where the were also located. It is likely that women played a central role in the plant domestication throughout these developments. Um, various explanations of the causes of the Neolithic Revolution have been proposed. Now, some theories identify population growth as the main factor leading people to seek out new food sources. Now, others see population growth not as the cause, but as the effect of the associated improvements in food supply. Now, further suggested factors include climate change, resource scarcity, and ideology. Now, the translation to agriculture created food surpluses that could support people and not directly engaged in food problem, permitting far denser populations in the creation of the first cities and states. Um, when it comes to cities, cities were centers of trade, manufacturing, and political power. Um, and if you had, you did pretty good. They developed mutually beneficial relationships within countrysides, receiving agricultural products and providing manufactured goods and varying degrees of political control in return. Now, pastoral societies based on nomadic animal herding also developed, mostly in dry areas unsuited to plant cultivation, such as the Eurasian steppe and the African Sahel. Conflict between nomadic herders and sedentary agriculturalists were frequent, and they became a recurring theme throughout modern history. Um, now metalworking was first used in the creation of copper tools and ornaments around 600 BC. Gold and silver would soon follow, and they were primarily for used in ornaments. The first signs of bronze and alloy of copper and tin date to around 4,500 BC, but the alloy was not widely used until the third millennium BC. Um, and you can see a pillar here. Let's turn this. There's two show. Here's a pillar at a Neolithic a pillar at Neolithic and it's got something called Gobekli Tepe. Let's see, and there's actually a story on that. It's an archaeological site. Okay, and then down here are pyramids of Giza. I stake out how the pyramids were ever built. And this down here is called cuneiform inscription, and that's actually in Turkey. So now the Bronze Age saw the development of cities and civilizations. Early civilizations are closest around close to the rivers, because it had access to water and access to food. Um, they rose first early in Mesopotamia around 33,000 or 3,300 BC, with the Tigris and the Euphrates, followed by the Egyptian civilization along the Nile River around BC. Um, Chico civilization 3,100 BC, and the Indus Valley civilization and northwest 500 BC. Now, in the Chinese civilization along the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers around 2200 BC, these societies they developed a number of shared characteristics, including a central government, a complex economy and social structure, and systems for keeping records. Now, these cultures variously invented the wheel. They created mathematics, bronze working, sailing boats, and the potter's wheel. They wove cloth. They constructed a lot of monumental buildings and writing. Polytheistic religions developed centered on temples where priests and priestesses performed sacrificial rites. Um, Now, oh shit. Okay. So writing facilitated the administration of cities, the expression of ideas, and the preservation of information. It may have been independently developed in at least four ancient civilizations: Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and Mesoamerica. Now, the earliest system of writing was the Mesopotamian cuneiform script, which began as a system of pictographs, whose pictorial representations of Egyptian hieroglyphics, and the Indus script. Now, in China, writing was first used during the Shang Dynasty around 1766 to the years of 1766 and 1045 BC. Um, Now, as they didn't have cars back then, transportation was facilitated by waterways, including rivers and seas, which were the project exchange of goods, ideas, and inventions. The Bronze Age also saw new technologies such as a horse-based cavalry and chariots that allowed armies to move faster. Now, trade became increasingly in the beginnings of the archaic globalization. Now, bronze production in Southwest Asia, for example, required the import of tin from as far away as England. Now, the growth of cities was often followed by the establishment of states and empires. In Egypt, the initial division into Upper and Lower Egypt was followed by the unification of the whole valley around um, 3100 BC. Around 2600 BC, the Indus Valley civilization built major cities, Harappa and Odaro. Now, Mesopotamian history was characterized by frequent wars between city-states, leading to shifts in hegemony from one city to another. Now, in the 25th and the 21st century BCE, the empires of Akkad and the Neo-Sumerians arose in this area. The Minoan civilization emerged around 2000 BC and is regarded as the first civilization in all of Europe. Now, here. Now over now over the following millennia, civilizations developed across the world. By 1600 BC, Messenian Greece began to develop. It flourished until the late Bronze Age collapse that affected many Mediterranean civilizations between the years 1300 and 1000 BC. Now, these foundations of many cultural aspects in India were laid in the Vedic period around 1750 BC. Now, and of Hinduism. From around 550 BC, many independent kingdoms and republics known as the Mahajanapadas were established across the subcontinent. Now, I don't know if I said that right, but you know. Speakers of the Bantu language began expanding across Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa as early as 3000 BC and 1000 CE. Their expansion and encounters with other groups resulted in the displacement of the Pygmy people and the Khoisan. Um, and then the spread of mixed farming and ironworking throughout Saharan Africa, and this laid the foundation for later on states. Um, Now here is a, and this is at the museum, and this is at some museum, and whatever it's at, because I can't really say the language, um, or speak it anyway. Now the Lapita culture emerged in the Bismarck archipelago near New Guinea around 1500 BC, and they colonized many uninhabited lands of the remote Oceania region as far as Samoa by 700 BC. Um, oh shit, my back. Okay, so in the Americas, the Norte Chico culture emerged in Peru around 3100 BC. The Norte Chico built public monumental architecture at the city of Corral, dated to around 2627 BCE, and the later the Shaban polity is sometimes described as the first Andean state. Now, and this is centered around the religious sites at Shaban Duhontar. Other important Andean cultures include the Moche, whose ceramics depict many aspects of daily life, and the Nazca. Now, the Olmecs of Mesoamerica developed around 1200 BC and are known for the columns that they come from basalt. They also devised a Mesoamerican calendar that was used by later cultures such as the Maya and the Teotihuacan. Societies in North America were primarily egalitarian. Um, were egalitarian hunter-gatherers, supplementing that diet with the plants of the Eastern agricultural complex. They built earthworks such as the Watson Break and the Poverty Point, both in Louisiana. Now, here's a picture of a standing Muda from Gandhara. Um, Now these type of statues are very fascinating. Um, Same thing with museums. Museums have a lot of interesting stuff. Between the years 800 to 200 BC, the Axial Age saw the emergence of transformative philosophical and religious ideas that developed in many different places, most independently of each other, like Chinese Confucianism, Indian Buddhism, and Jainism, and Jewish monotheism. All of these religions arose during this period. Now, the Persian Zoroastrianism early, perhaps around 1000 BC, but was institutionalized by the Achaemenid Empire during the Axial Age. Philosophies took hold during the 5th century BC and epitomized by thinkers such as Plato and Aristotle. Um, the first Olympic Games were held in 776 BC, marking a period known as the Classical Antiquity. In around 508 BC, the world's first democratic system of government was instituted in Athens, Greece. Um, Now, the Axial Age ideas shaped subsequent intellectual and religious history. Confucianism was one of the three schools of thought that came to dominate Chinese thinking, along with Taoism and legalism. Now, the Confucian tradition, which would become particularly influential, looked for political morality not to be the force of law, but to be the power of tradition. Um, Confucian later spread to Korea and Japan. Buddhism reached China in about the first century, and it spread widely with 30,000 Buddhist temples in northern China alone. Buddhism became the main religion in much of South in the much of in much of Southeast and East Asia. The Greek philosophical tradition, diffused throughout the Mediterranean world and as far as India, starting in the fourth century. After the conquest of Alexander the Great of Macedon, both Christianity and Islam developed from the beliefs of Judaism. Um, now the millennium from 500 BC to 500 between 500 BC to 580 saw a series of empires of unprecedented size development. Well-trained professional armies, unifying ideologies, and advanced bureaucracies created the possibility for emperors to rule over large domains whose populations could attain numbers upwards of tens of millions of subjects. International trade also expanded, most notably the massive trade routes in the Mediterranean Sea, the maritime trade web in the Indian Ocean, and the Silk Road. Um, Now, the kingdom of the Medes helped to destroy the Assyrian Empire in tandem with the nomadic Nineveh, the capital of sacked by the Medes in around 600 and around 612 BC. The Median Empire gave way to successive Iranian states, including the Achaemenid Empire, which ruled from 550 to 330 BC. The Parthian, which ruled between 247 and 224 BC, and the Sassanian Empire, which ruled from 224 um, BC to around 651. And here's an actual carving of the Persian and the Median soldiers. This is during the Achaemenid Empire, and you can see that. Now, two major empires began in modern day. Now, two major empires began in modern day Greece. In the late 5th century BC, several Greek city states checked the Achaemenid and Persian advance in Europe throughout the Greco-Persian War. Now, these wars were followed by the Golden Age of Athens, the seminal period of ancient performances, the wars of BC, and eventually the Athenian Empire, um, which was around between the years of 454 and 404 BC. Which was defeated by the Spartan-led coalition during the Peloponnesian. Now, Philip of Macedon unified the Greek city-states into the Hellenic League. Alexander the Great, who was born in 356 and died in 323, founded an empire extending from the present-day Greece to India. The empire divided into several successor states shortly after he died, resulting in the founding of many cities and the spread of Greek culture throughout conquered regions, a process referred to as Hellenization. The Hellenistic period lasted from the death of Alexander in 323 BC until 31 BC, when the Ptolemaic Egypt fell to Rome. And here's a picture of the Roman Colosseum in Rome, Italy. I would love to see that. This is where they do all the Roman gladiator fights. Um, Now, in Europe, the Roman Republic was the 6th century BC, and it began expanding its territory into the 3rd century BC. Now, prior to this, the Carthaginian Empire had dominated the Mediterranean, however, but they lost 3 successive wars to the Romans. The Republic became an empire, and by the time of Augustus, it had established dominion over most of the Mediterranean. Now, the empire continued to reach its peak under Trajan, controlling much of the land from England to Mesopotamia. The 2 centuries that followed are known as Pax Romana, a period of unprecedented peace, prosperity, and political stability in all of Europe. Um, Now, Christianity was legalized by Constantine the First in 313. After 3 centuries of imperial persecution, it became a sole official religion of the empire in around 380. While the Emperor Theodosius outlawed pagan religions in around 391 to 392 BC. Um, um, In South Asia, Chandragupta Maurya founded the Maurya Empire in around 320, and it was around up until around 185 BC, which flourished under Ashoka the Great. Um, from the 4th to the 6th century, the Gupta Empire oversaw the period before the Age that helped usher in a flourishing period for Hindu and Buddhist culture in around the 4th and 5th centuries, as well as major advances in science and mathematics. In South Asia, the three prominent Dravidian kingdoms emerged: the Chola Pandyas. Now, I'm not sure if I'm saying those right. Um, in China, Qin Shi Huang put an end to the chaotic warring states period by uniting all of the Chinese under the Qin dynasty around 221 to 206 BC. Now Qin Shi Huang was an adherent of the legalist school of thought, and he displaced the hereditary aristocracy by creating an efficient system of administration that was staffed by officials appointed according to merit. Now, the harshness of the Qin dynasty led to rebellions and the dynasty's fall, but it was followed by the Han dynasty, which combined the legalist bureaucratic system with Confucian ideals. The Han dynasty was comparable in power and influence to the Roman Empire that lay at the other end of the Silk Road. Um, as economic prosperity fueled their military expansion, um, the Han conquered parts of Mongolia, Central Asia, Manchuria, Korea, and northern Vietnam. Now, as with other empires during the classical period, Han China advanced significantly in the areas of government, education, and science and technology. But the Han era had invented the compass, which is one of China's four great inventions. Um, in Africa, the kingdom of Kush prospered through its interactions with both Egypt and sub-Saharan Africa. Ruled Egypt as the 25th dynasty from 712 to 650 BC, and then it an agricultural and of Aksum, centered in present day Ethiopia, and established itself by the first century as a major trading empire, and it dominated its neighbors in South Arabia and Kush and controlled sea trade. It minted its own currency and carved enormous monolithic marks. Now the successful empires were also established in the Americas, arising from cultures established as early as 2500 BC. And Mesoamerica societies built, the most notable being the Zapotec civilization, which was around between 700 BC to 1521 AD, and the Maya civilization, which reached its height state of development during the Mesoamerica Classic period, between 250 BC to 908 AD or something like that. But it continued throughout the post-classical period. The great Mayan city-states were slowly rose in number and prominence, and Maya culture spread throughout the Yucatan and surrounding areas. Now the Mayan developed a writing system, and they used the concept of zero in their mathematics. Now west of area in central Mexico, the city of Teotihuacan prospered due to its control of the Indian trade. Peaked around 450 AD, when its 25,000 to 150,000 inhabitants made it one of the world's largest cities to live in. Um, Now, technology developed sporadically in the ancient world. There were periods of there were periods at times of rapid technological progress, such as the Greco-Roman era in the Mediterranean region. Greek science, technology, and mathematics are generally considered to have reached their peak during the Hellenistic period, typified by devices such as the in Antikythera mechanism. Now, I'm not sure what that particularly is, but is highlighted. So maybe later on I'll look that up and see what that is. Um, Now there were also periods of the technological decay, such as the ensuing early medieval period. Two of the most important innovations were paper, that was in China first century, and the stirrup between India, um, and both of which diffused widely throughout the world. The Chinese learned to make silk and built massive engineering projects, which resulted in the Great Wall of China and the Grand Canal. Basically, the Great Wall of China is to keep the enemies out. I'm not sure about the Grand Canal. Um, Now the Romans were very accomplished and skilled builders. They invented concrete. They perfected the use of arches and construction, and they created aqueducts to transport water over long distances to urban centers. Now during most ancient societies, they practiced slavery, which was particularly prevalent in Athens and Rome, where slaves made up a large proportion of the population and were foundational and they were foundational to the economy. Patriarchy was also common, with men controlling more political and economic power than men. Uh, Now, many ancient empires faced common problems that were associated with maintaining huge armies and supporting a central bureaucracy. Now, during Rome and Han China, the state began to decline, and barbarian pressure on the frontiers hastened internal dissolution. The Han Dynasty fell into civil war in 220 and in around 220, began the Three Kingdom century. Um, from the Eurasian steppe, horse-based nomads dominated large parts of the continent. The development of the stirrup and the use of horse archers made the nomads a constant threat to sedentary civilizations. In around the fourth century AD, the Roman Empire split into Western and Eastern religions and regions, um, with usually separate emperors. The Western Roman Empire fell in 476 CE to German influence under Odoacer in the migration period of the Germanic people. The, um, the, um, the Eastern Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire, was more long-lasting, and China dynasties rose and fell, but in sharp contrast to the Mediterranean European world, political unity was always eventually restored. But after the fall of the Eastern Han Dynasty and the demise of the Three Kingdoms, nomadic tribes from the north began to invade, causing many Chinese people to flee southward. Um, Post-classical period dated roughly from the 500 to 1500s AD, which was characterized by the rise of religions, while civilizations expanded to new parts of the world and trade between societies intensified. From the 15th to the 13th centuries, the medieval warm period in the northern hemisphere aided agriculture, and it led to population growth in parts of Europe and Asia. It was followed by the Little Ice Age, which, along with the powder, guns, printing press, all of which originated in China. Um, Now, the post classical period encompasses the early Muslim conquest, the Islamic Golden Age, and the commencement and expansion of the Arab slave trade, followed by the Mongol invasions and the founding of the Ottoman Empire. South Asia had a series of middle kingdoms, followed by the establishment of Islamic empires in India. Um, in West Africa, the Mali and the Songhai empires rose, but on the southeast coast of Africa, Arabic were established were gold, spices, and other commodities that were traded. This allowed Africa to join the Southeast Asia trading system, bringing it in contact with Asia, and this resulted in the Swahili culture. Um, experienced the relatively successful Sui, Tang, Song, Yuan, and early Ming dynasties. Now, Middle Eastern trade routes along the Indian Ocean and the Silk Road throughout the Gobi Desert provided limited economic and cultural contact with European civilizations. Um, Now, during the same period, civilizations in the Americas, such as the Mississippians, the Aztecs, the Mayans, and Inca, reached their zenith. Um, now, um, now here is a mosque in Damascus. Um, now, before the advent of Islam in the 7th century, the Middle East was dominated by the Byzantine and Sassanian empires, which frequently fought each other for the control of several disputed regions. This was a cultural battle with Byzantine Christian culture competing against Persian Zoroastrian tradition. Um, um, Now, the birth of Islam created a new contender that quickly surpassed both of these type of empires. Um, Now, Muhammad, who was the founder of Islam, initiated the early Muslim conquest in the 7th century. He established a new unified polity in Arabia that expanded rapidly under the Rashidun Caliphate and the Umayyad Caliphate, culminated in the establishment of Muslim on three different continents: Asia, Africa, and Europe by 750 AD. Now, the subsequent Abbasid Caliphate oversaw the Islamic Golden Age, which was an era of learning, science, and invention during which philosophy, art, and literature all flourished. Um, Now, scholars preserved and synthesized knowledge and skills of ancient Greece and Persia, the manufacture of paper from China, and the decimal positional numbering system from India. At the same time, they made significant original contributions in various fields, such as Khwarizmi's development of algebra, which I cannot stand, um, and the and the and the Avicenna's comprehensive philosophical system. Islamic civilization expanded both by conquest and based on its merchant economy. Merchants brought goods and their Islamic faith to China, India, Southeast Asia, and Africa. Um, Domination of the ended in the mid 11th century with the arrival of the Turks, um, or the Seljuk Turks migrating south from the Turkic homelands. The Seljuks were challenged by Europe during the Crusades, a series of religious wars aimed at rolling back Muslim territory and regaining control of the Holy Land. Which is there's a movie made about it called Kingdom of Heaven. Um, Now, the Crusaders were ultimately unsuccessful and served more to weaken the Byzantine Empire, especially with the sack of Constantinople in 1204. Um, Now, in the early 13th century, a new wave of invaders, the Mongols, swept through the region, but they were eventually eclipsed by the Turks and the founding of the Ottoman Empire in modern-day Turkey around 1299. In the 7th century, North Africa saw the extinguishment of the Byzantine Africa and the Berber kingdoms in the early Muslim conquest. From the 10th century, the Abbasid Caliphate African territory were consumed by the Fatimid Caliphate that was centered on Egypt, which were supplemented by the Ayyubids in the 12th century, and then later Mamluks in the 13th century. Um, in the Maghreb and the Western Sahara, the Almoravids dominated from the 11th century until it was subsumed by the Almohad Caliphate in the 12th century. The Almohads collapse gave rise to the Marinids in Morocco, the Zionids in Algeria, and the Hafsids in Tunisia. Um, fought over in a series of wars between the Byzantine and Sasanian empires. However, the two opposing conflict. Now, hence the Rashidun Caliphate, they were able to freely expand into the region during the early Muslim conquest. The Seljuk Turks later subjugated 11th century, and not Georgia the state, but there is a country called Georgia. Um, the Mongols subsequently invaded the Caucasus the Caucasus in the 13th century. Now, the steppe nomads from the Central Asia continued to threaten sedentary societies in the post-classical era. They also faced incursions from the Arabs and the Chinese. Now, China expanded into Central Asia during the Sui dynasty, which is spelled Sui, between the years 518. The Chinese were confronted by Turkic nomads who were becoming the most dominant ethnic group in the region. Originally, the relationship was largely cooperative around, but in 630, the Tang dynasty began an offensive against the Turks by capturing areas of the Orange Desert. In the 8th century, Islam began to penetrate the region and soon became the sole faith of most of the population. Though Buddhism remained strong in the east, but from the 9th to the 13th century, Central Asia was divided among several powerful states, including the Samanid, the Seljuk, and the Khwarizm, no, I'm not sure if I'm saying this right. Khazarian empires. Not sure if I said that right at all. But these states were succeeded by the Mongols in the 13th century. In 1370, Timur, a Turk in the Mongol military tradition, conquered most of the region and founded the Timurid Empire. But Timur's large empire collapsed soon after his in Central Asia and Iran. They oversaw the Timurid Renaissance and architecture. Now, now there is a college called Notre Dame, but that's not what I'm talking about here. But there is a thing called Notre Dame de Paris in France, um, and that is a thing called the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, France. Um, since at least the 4th century, Christianity has played a prominent role in shaping agriculture or shaping culture basically. Um, and the values and the institutions of Western civilization, primarily through Catholicism and later also Protestantism. Europe during the early Middle Ages was characterized by depopulation, deurbanization, and barbarian invasions, all of which had begun in late antiquity. The barbarian invaders formed their own new kingdoms in the remains of the Western Roman Empire, although there were substantial changes in society and political structures, and most of the new kingdoms incorporated existing Roman institutions. Now, Christianity expanded in Western Europe, and monasteries were founded. A lot of them were. But during the 7th and 8th century, the Franks were under the Carolingian dynasty, and they established an empire covering all of Europe, or most of it anyway. It lasted until the 9th century when it succumbed to pressure from new invaders like the Vikings, the Magyars, and Arabs. It split into West France and East France, which developed into Middle Ages France and the Holy Roman Empire and Middle Age Germany. During the Carolingian era, churches developed a form of musical notation called mumi, which became the basis for the modern notation system. Um, The Kievan Rus expanded from its capital in Kiev to become the largest state in Europe by the 10th century. In 988, Vladimir the Great adopted Orthodox Christianity as the state religion. Uh, Now, during the High Middle Ages, which began after 1000, the population of Europe increased as technological and agricultural innovations allowed for trade to flourish and crop yields to increase. Now, the establishment of the feudal system affected the structure of medieval society and included manorialism, the organization of peasants into villages that owed rent and labor service to nobles, and vassalage and political structure where knights and lower status nobles owed military service to their overlords in return for the rights to rent from lands and manors. The kingdoms became more centralized after the decentralizing effects of the Carolingian Empire. In 1054, the Great Schism between the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches led to the prominent cultural differences between Western and Eastern Europe. Um, Now, the Crusades are a series of religious wars that were waged by Christians to wrestle control of the Holy Land from the Muslims, and they succeeded for long enough to establish some Crusader states in the Levant. Italian merchants imported slaves to work in houses or in sugar processing. Intellectual life was marked by scholasticism and the founding of universities, while the building of Gothic cathedrals and churches was one of the outstanding artistic achievements of that age. Um, Now, the Middle Ages witnessed the first sustained urbanization of northern and western Europe, and lasted until the beginning of the early modern period in the 16th century. Um, The Mongols reached Europe in 1236, and they conquered Kievan Rus, invading Poland and Hungary. Um, Lithuania cooperated with the Mongols but remained independent, and in the late 14th century they formed a personal union with Poland. During the late Middle Ages, they were marked by difficulties and calamities. Famine, plague, and war devastated the population of Western Europe. The Black Death alone killed approximately 75 million to 200 million people between the years of 1347 and 1350. Um, Now, this was one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, starting in Asia, east of the Mediterranean, and Western Europe during the late 1340s, and it killed tens of millions of Europeans in 6 years. Between a quarter and a third of the population had perished. Um, Sub-Saharan Africa was home to many different civilizations. In Nubia, the kingdom of Kush was succeeded by the Christian kingdoms of Mercuria and Nabatea. In the 7th century, um, Mercuria conquered Nabatea to become the dominant power in the region, and they resisted Muslim expansion. Now, they later entered a severe decline following civil war, and Arab migrations to the Sudan had disintegrated by the 15th century, giving rise to the Fungi Sultanate. In the Horn of Africa, spread of the kingdom of Aksum declined from the 7th century, following Muslim dominance over the Red Sea trade, collapsed in the Sultan with Shiwa and the powerful kingdom of um, In the 13th century, the Zagwe were overthrown by the Monarch dynasty of the Ethiopian Empire. The Shawe, the Wallachma dynasty, and Ethiopia emerged victorious against Abat, and they occupied the Muslim states. Sultanate rose on the Horn's east coast to dominate the Indian Ocean trade, but Abat was succeeded by the Adal Sultanate, who reconquered much of the Muslim lands. In the Sahel region of West Africa, the Ghana Empire formed from around between the 2nd and 8th century, while from the 7th century the Ghana Aldegost led to Ghana's conversion to Islam in the 11th century, and the climate changes led to Ghana's conquest its vassal Sasso in the 13th century. Now, Sasso was quickly overthrown by the Mali Empire, who conquered Gao and that dominated the trans-Saharan trade. Kingdoms were established to its south, but to the east, the Kanem Borno Empire ruled from the 6th century, and they projected power over the Hausa kingdoms. The 15th century saw the crumbling of the Mali Empire, with power in the region becoming the Songhai Empire centered on Gao. In the forest regions of West Africa, various kingdoms and empires flourished, such as the Yoruba Empire of If and Oyo, the Igbo and the Igbo Kingdom of Nari, the Edo Kingdom of Benin, famous for its art, the Gamba Kingdom of Dagban, and the Akan Kingdom of Banoman. They came into contact with the Portuguese in the 15th century, which saw the start of the Atlantic slave trading. In the Congo Basin by the 13th century, there were three main confederations of states: the Seven Kingdoms, Mapemba, which was one led by Vangu. In the 14th century, the Kingdom of Congo emerged and dominated the region. And further east, the Luba Empire was founded, and was founded in the Upemba Depression in the 15th century. In the northern Great Lakes, the Empire of Katara rose around the 11th century, and there were frames for its total lack of record. It collapsed in the 15th century following the Luo migrations in the region. Now on the Swahili coast, to the when it comes to the Swahili city state, they carved up the Indian Ocean trade, and they gradually Islamized and moved to the Islamic religion, giving rise to the Kilwa Sultanate around the 10th century. Madagascar was settled by the Austronesians around the 5th and 7th century, and societies organized at the behest of Hassan Shah. In southern Africa, early kingdoms included Mala and the Mapangawabi, followed by the Kingdom of Zimbabwe. And this was in the 13th century, and the Mutapa Empire in the 15th century. After the Gupta Empire in around 550, North India was divided into a complex and fluid network of smaller kingdoms. Early Muslim incursions began in the northwest in around the year 711, when the Arab Umayyad Caliphate conquered much of the present-day Pakistan. The Arab military advance was largely halted at that point, but Islam still spread in India largely due to the influence of Arab merchants along the western coast. The 9th century saw the Triperiot struggle for control of North between the Pratajira, Pala, and the Rashtrakuta Empire. The post-classic dynasties in South India included those of the Chalukyas, the Hoysalas, and the Cholas. Literature, architecture, sculpture, and painting flourished under the patronage of these kings, but some of the other important states that emerged in South India during this time included the Mami Sultanate and the Vaja Yanagara Empire. After a period of relative disunity, China was by the Sui dynasty in around 589. During stability and economic prosperity by literary and artistic accomplishment, likely the poetry of Li Bai and Du Fu. Now the Sui and Tang instituted the long-lasting imperial examination system, under which administrative positions were open only to those who passed an artist test, Asian thought, and the Chinese classics. Now China would compete with Tibet around 618 to 842 for the control of areas in Inner Asia. However, the Tang dynasty eventually would be splintered. After half a century of turmoil, the Song dynasty reunified much of China. Pressure from the nomadic empires to the north became increasingly urgent. By 1127, northern China had been lost to the Jurchens in the Jin Song Wars, and the Mongols conquered all of China in the year 1279. After about a century of Mongol Yuan, the ethnic Chinese reasserted control of the founding to the Ming Dynasty in around 1368. Now in Japan, the imperial lineage was established during the third century and centralized during the Yamato period. Um, Buddhism was introduced, and there was an emphasis on the adoption of elements of Chinese culture and Confucianism. The Nara period, which happened in the years of 710 and 794, was characterized by the appearance of a nascent literary culture as well as the development of Buddhist-inspired work and architecture. Um, Now the Heian period, which was around between the year 794 to 1185, they saw the peak of imperial power, the rise of militarized clans and the samurai. It was during the Heian period that Musaraki Shikbi penned the tale of Genji, sometimes considered the world's first novel. From 1185 to 1868, Japan was dominated by powerful regional lords and the military rule of warlords, shoguns, such as the Ashikawa um, and um, and Tokugawa shogunates. The empire remained, but it did not wield significant influence. Now, meanwhile, the power of the merchants grew. An influential art style known as Tokugawa years, consisting of wood block prints, which were originally depicting famous artisans. Um, Now, post-classical Korea saw the end of the Three Kingdoms era, in which the kingdoms of Goguryeo, Ryo, Bakshi, and Silla had completed for hegemony. Um, this period ended when Silla conquered Bakshi in 660, and and go and go and Goguryeo in 668. And this marked the beginning of the northern and southern states period, with unified Silla in the south and Balhae a successor state to Goguryeo in the north. In 892, this reverted to the later three kingdoms, with Goguryeo emerging as dominant and unifying the entire peninsula by 936. Um, Now, the founding of Goryeo dynasty ruled until 1392, succeeded by the Joseon dynasty, which ruled for approximately 500 years. Um, Now, in Mongolia, Genghis Khan united the various Mongol and Turkic tribes under one banner in 1206. The Mongol Empire expanded to comprise all of China and Central Asia, as well as large parts of Russia and the Middle East, to become the largest contiguous empire in history. After Mangi Khan died in 1259, the Mongol Empire was divided into four successor states: the Yuan dynasty in China, the the Chagatai Asia, the Golden Horde in Eastern Europe, and the Ilkhanate in Iran. Um, Now, the Southeast Asian polity of Yunnan, which had originated in the second century, went into a decline in the sixth century as Chinese trade routes shifted away from its ports. Khmer Empire in 802, the capital city of Angkor was the most extensive city in the world before the industrial age, and it contained Angkor Wat, the world's largest religious monument, and that's this. Um, this is the Angkor Wat, which is the world's largest religious monument. And this is in Cambodia. I don't know if that Sorry about that. So, um, now in South America, the 15th century saw the rise of the Inca. Um, the Inca Empire, with its capital at Cusco, spanned the entire Andes, making extensive pre-Columbian civilization. The Inca people were very prosperous and they advanced, and they were known for an excellent road system and elegant stonework. Um, Now, the early modern period is the era following the middle during the which was following the European Middle Ages, between 1789 and 1800. A common break with the medieval period is placed between 1450 and 1500, and which included a number of significant events, which was the fall of to the Ottoman Empire and to the spread of the printing and the European voyages of discovery to America and along the African coast. Warfare, military forces, or land and sea increased, along the wider propagation of gunpowder. Now, the early modern period is significant for the start of the proto-globalization, increasingly civilized bureaucratic states and early forms of capitalism. European powers also began colonizing large parts of maritime empires. First, the Portuguese and the Spanish empires, then the French, English, and Dutch Empire. Historians still debate the causes of Europe's rise. Um, um, here's Machu Picchu, which is a part of the Inca Empire, and this is in Peru. That's this little the mountain thing up here. This is Machu Picchu, and then down here is a Japanese depiction of Portuguese sailors, of a Portuguese carrack, a result of globalization, maritime trade. Um, Sorry about that. Now, capitalist economies emerged initially in the northern Italian republics and some Asian port cities. Now, European states practiced mercantilism by implementing one-side trade policies that were designed to benefit the mother country at the expense of its colonies. Now, starting at the end of the 15th century, the Portuguese established trading posts across Africa, Asia, and Brazil for commodities like gold and spices, while also practicing slavery. Um, in the 17th century, private charter companies such as the English East India Company in 1600, often described as the first multinational corporation, and the Dutch East India Company in 1602. Meanwhile, in much of the European sphere, serfdom declined and eventually disappeared while the power of the Catholic Church waned. Now, the Age of Discovery was the first period in which the old world engaged in substantial cultural, material, and biological exchange with the New World. It began in the late 15th century when Portugal and Castile sent the first exploratory voyages to the Americas, where Christopher Columbus first arrived in 1492. But global integration continued as Europe colonization of the Americas initiated the Columbian exchange, the exchange of plants, animals, food, human populations, including slaves, communicable diseases, and culture began the eastern and western hemispheres. It was one of history's most important global events involving ecology and agriculture. Um, New crops brought from the Americas by 16th century European seafarers substantially contributed to the world population growth. Now, the Ottoman Empire quickly came to dominate the Middle East after conquering Constantinople in 1403, which marked the end of the Byzantine Empire. Persia came under the rule of the Safavids in 1501, succeeded by the Akshars in 1736, the Zands in 1751, and the Qajars in 1794. The Safavids established the Shia Islam as Persia's official religion, thus giving separate identity from its Sunni neighbors. along with the Mughals and the Mongols in India. And the Safavids are known as the Gunpowder Empires because of their early. Now throughout the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire conquered all of North Asia except for Morocco, which came under the rule of the Saudi dynasty at the same time, and then the Alawite dynasty in the 17th century. At the end of the 18th power in Central Asia. Um, Now here is the economic and social rise of Europe. Now, Petrarch's poetry, Giovanni Buca, Boccaccio's Decameron, and the paintings and sculptures of Leonardo da Vinci and Albrecht Dürer as part of the Northern Renaissance are some of the great works of the age. In the Renaissance came the Reformation, an anti-clerical theological and social movement started in Germany under Martin Luther that resulted in the creation of Protestant Christianity. Um, Now, the Renaissance also engendered a cultural of inquisitiveness, which led to humanism and the scientific revolution, an effort to understand the natural world through direct observation and experiment. Um, the success of the new scientific techniques inspired attempts to apply them to political and social affairs, known as the Age of Enlightenment by thinkers such as John Locke and Immanuel Kant. This development was accompanied by secularization as it continued to the influence of religious beliefs of public and private spheres. Of Johannes Gutenberg's invention of the movable type printing in 1440 helped spread the ideas of the new intellectual movement. Now, in addition to changes that was wrought by incipient capitalism and colonialism, early modern Europeans experienced an increase in the power of the states. Absolute monarchs in France, Russia, the Habsburg lands, and Prussia produced powerful centralized states with strong armies and efficient bureaucracies under the control of a king. Um, in Russia, Ivan the Terrible was crowned in 1547 as the first Tsar of Russia, and by annexing the Khanates in the east, and it transformed Russia into a regional power, eventually replacing the Polish, Lithuanian, major power in Eastern Europe. Um, Now, the countries of Western Europe are prodigiously throughout the technological advances and colonial conquest, but they competed with each other economically and militarily in a state of almost constant war. Now, wars of particular note included the 30 Years' War, the War of the Spanish Succession, the 7 Years' War, and the French Revolutionary War. Now, the French Revolution, starting in 1789, laid the groundwork of liberal democracy by overthrowing monarchy. It led to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte and the subsequent Napoleonic Wars of the early 19th century. Now, here is a picture of Germany, which is the birthplace of Protestantism. Um, Now, in the Horn of Africa, there was the Oromo expansion in the 16th century, which weakened Ethiopia and that caused Adel's collapse. Um, Ajuran was succeeded by the Golidi Sultanate. In the late 19th and early 20th century, Ethiopia rapidly expanded. Um, Now, in West Africa, the Songhai Empire fell Moroccan invasion in the late 16th century, but they were succeeded by the Bamana Empire, the Fulgi of the Fullah Jihads. The 18th century led to the establishment of the Sokoto Caliphate, the Messina Empire, and the Tukulur Empire. In the forest regions, the Asante Empire were established in present 1515 and 1800. 8 million Africans were exported in the Atlantic slave trade. In the Congo Basin, the Congo fought 3 wars against the Portuguese who had begun colonizing Angola, which ended the conquest of the Dongo in the 17th century. Now, further east, the Lunda Empire rose to dominate the region. It fell to the Chakri in the 19th century, but in the northern Great Lakes, there were the kingdoms of Bunyoro, Buganda, and Rwanda, among others. Um, Kilwa was conquered by the Portuguese in the 16th century as they began colonizing Mozambique. They were defeated by the Amani Empire, who took control of the Swahili coast. And again, in the 16th century, and the 16th century onward, saw the emergence of the Imarina, the Betsilo kingdoms, and the Sakalava Empire. Imarina conquered most of the island in the 19th century, and the Zambia basin. Mutapa was followed by the Raspberry Empire, with Marabi around Lake Malawi to the northwest. Um, Wakazi succeeded Raspberry further south, but the Dutch began colonizing South Africa in the 16th century, who lost it to the British. In the 19th century, Dutch settlers formed various Boer republics, while the Mepakane ravaged the region and led to the establishment of various African kingdoms. Um, and here's a picture of India. That's this up here with the pillars, and underneath here and underneath the Taj Mahal picture is the Great Wall of China, which covers the whole country. Um, In the Indian subcontinent, the Mughal Empire was established under Babur in 1526, and it lasted for 200 years. Starting in the northwest, it brought the entire subcontinent under Muslim rule by the late 17th century, except for the southernmost Indian provinces, which remained independent. To resist the Muslim rulers, the Hindu Maratha Empire was founded by the Shivaji on the western coast in 1674. Um, the Marathas gradually gained territory from the Mughals over several decades, particularly the Maghai Maratha Wars, which lasted from 1680 to 1707. Now, Sikhism develops. In 1799, Ranjit Singh established the Sikh Empire in Punjabi. Now, in 1644, the Ming dynasty were supplanted by the Qing, the imperial dynasty, which ruled until 1912. Japan experienced Momoyama period between 1568 and 1600, followed by the Edo period. The Korean Joseon dynasty ruled throughout this period from 1392 to 1910, and the repelling invasions from Japan and China in the 16th and 17th century. Now, it expanded the maritime trade with Europe, significantly affected China and Japan, but during this period, particularly through the Portuguese and Macau, and the Dutch and Nagasaki. However, China and Japan later pursued the isolationist policies that were designed to eliminate foreign influences. Um, in 1511, the Portuguese overthrew the Malacca Sultanate in present-day Malaysia and Indonesia and Sumatra. The Portuguese held this important trading territory and the valuable associated by the Dutch in 1641. The Sultanate centered on the southern peninsula, which became the dominant trading power in the region. European colonization expanded with the Dutch in Indonesia, the Portuguese in Timor, and the Spaniards in the Philippines. And when it comes to Oceania, the Pacific islands of Oceania were also affected by European contact, starting with the circumnavigational voyage of Ferdinand Magellan around between 1519 and 1522, and who landed on the Marino Islands. Abel Tasman, also present-day Australia, New Zealand, and nearby islands. James Cook made the first recorded European contact with Hawaii. Britain founded its first Australian colony. Now, several European powers colonized the Americans, largely displacing the native populations and conquering the advanced civilizations of the Aztecs and the Inca. Now, diseases were introduced by Europeans, devastated American societies, killing 60 to 90 million people by 1600 and reducing the population by 95%. But in some cases, colonial policies included the deliberate genocide of indigenous people. Spain, Portugal, Britain, and France all made extensive territorial claims, and they undertook large-scale settlements, including the importation of large numbers of African slaves. Now, one side effect of the slave trade was a most cultural exchange through which various African traditions found their way to the Americas, including cuisine, music, and dance. Portugal claimed Brazil, while Spain seized the rest of South America, Mesoamerica, and southern North America. The Spaniards mined and exported um, prodigious prodigious amounts of gold and silver, leading to a surge in inflation known as the price revolution in the 16th centuries in Western Europe. In North America, Britain colonized the east coast, while France settled the central region. Russia made incursions into the northwest coast of North America, with its first colony in present-day Alaska in 1784, and the outpost of Fort Ross in present-day California in 1812. France lost its North American territory in England and Spain after the Seven Years' War, which lasted from 1756 to 1763. Britain's 13 colonies declared independence as the United States in 1776. That was ratified by the Treaty of Paris in 1783, ending the American Revolutionary War. But in 1791, African slaves launched a successful rebellion in the French colony of Saint Dominique. France won back its continental claims from Spain in 1800, but sold them to the United States in the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. So the long 19th century traditionally starts with the French Revolution in 1789 and lasted until the outbreak of the World War I in 1914. It saw the global spread of the Industrial Revolution, the greatest transformation of the world economy since the Neolithic revolution, and the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain around 1770, and it used new modes of production, like the factory, the mass production and mechanization to manufacture a wide array of goods, faster while using less labor than previously required. And one of the things that was invented during the Industrial Revolution was the steam engine, and you can see that right here. This is James Watt's steam engine, which James Watt was the guy that created it. So now, industrialization raised the global standard of living, but caused upheaval as factory owners and workers clashed over working conditions and workers' wages. Along with industrialization came modern globalization, the increasing interconnection of world regions in the economic, political, and cultural sphere. Globalization began in the early 19th century and was enabled by improved transportation technologies such as railroads and steamships. Now, European colonies, the European empires lost territories in Latin America, and they won independence by the 18 but expanded elsewhere as their industrial economies gave them an advantage over the rest of the world. Britain would gain control of the Indian subcontinent, Burma, Malaya, and North Borneo, Hong Kong, and Aden. The French took Indochina, and the Dutch cemented their rule over Indonesia. Now, the British also colonized Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, with large numbers of British colonists immigrating to these colonies. Um, Now, Russia colonized large pre-agricultural areas of Siberia. The United States completed its westward expansion, establishing control over the territory from the Atlantic to the Pacific coast. Now, in the late 19th century to early 20th century, the European powers, driven by the Second Industrial Revolution, had rapidly conquered and colonized the entirety of Africa. Um, Only Ethiopia and Liberia remained independent during that time, but imperial on the Nama genocide. Now within Europe, the economic and military competition fostered the creation and consolidation of nation states and other ethno-cultural communities that began to identify themselves as distinctive nations with aspirations for their own cultural anatomy. Now, this nationalization became important to people across the world in the 19th and 20th century, and the first wave of democratization between the years of 1828 and 1926, democratic institutions were enshrined and established to 33